Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. Appreciate you taking the time today to learn a little bit more about Homework Starts at Home and the request for proposals that's currently available. Today's session is really intended to give you some more background information about the RFP, provide a variety of perspectives of some of the funding partners that are involved in the program about what our hopes and aspirations are with the initiative. And really, a very primary important purpose for today is to have you have a chance to pose your questions. So before we go any further, I just want to note that this session is being recorded and it may be posted online. The recording would include the slides and the audio, just so everybody's aware of that. We do intend to leave ample time at the end of the session for questions. And as I'll cover in a minute, we also have a way for you to be posing questions whenever they occur to you throughout the session. We are happy to offer whatever preliminary answers we can during today's conversation, but the answers won't be considered final until they're posted in writing on Minnesota Housing Multifamily Grants Program page. So we'll take as many questions as you want to offer today. We'll answer as many as we're able, and we'll make sure that all the questions that get posed today have a written response posted as soon as possible on that webpage. Again, if you're joining us here at Minnesota Housing, please make sure that you've signed in and you've got a history badge. And if you park in one of the guest spots, that you get a parking validation as you leave that will cover the cost of your parking. If you're joining remotely, as 26 of you so far, 23 of you are so far, please make sure that you are muting your line either on your own phone, or if you're joining by phone, or if you're using the webinar, just make sure that the webinar audio controls are orange. That'll mean that they're muted. Please don't put us on hold, because that could actually cause hold music, which can be a very disruptive factor in an event like this. And just for folks that are joining on the webinar, please note that we are not monitoring the chat function. So if you put stuff in there, others may see it, but the presenters will not. So as I mentioned, we're really excited about getting your feedback today and throughout the entire session. And so one of the ways we've set up to do that is anybody participating today can post questions using the mentee tool. So if you're here in the room and have a mobile device, or if you're joining from your computer or some other location, you can go to mentee.com and enter the code 498819. That will prompt you with a question box. Then you can put in any questions that occur to you as they occur to you, and we will all be able to see those questions together at the end, and that'll be part of how we guide the Q&A part of the session. You can also ask your questions just orally, so that's fine as well, but a chance for you to not have to hold questions until we get to the end. We have a busy 90 minutes planned for us, and so really wanting to get into a lot of detail about the grant and some of the key features and requirements of the grant. Also make sure that everybody is clear about some of the requirements and scoring criteria that we'll use as we evaluate the proposals that get submitted. And finally, that we have a chance to talk a little bit about the very exciting research and evaluation that's coupled with this initiative. All that before we get to your questions, and we're trying to do that as quickly as we're able. So I'm Eric Grumdahl with the State Office to Prevent and End Homelessness and the Minnesota Department of Education, and I'm joined today by a fantastic team of folks, including Diane Elias from Minnesota Housing, Gene Sazevich from the Heading Home Minnesota Funders Collaborative, James Tigan with the Minnesota 2Gen Policy Network and MMD, and Dr. Ann Masten from the University of Minnesota. Each of them you'll be hearing from shortly. So, again, if you're joining by phone, please make sure to mute your line so that we are not hearing background noise here in the room, if that's possible.
Yeah, you can, honey.
And whatever that might be that we're just hearing. So please make sure if you're joining remotely to mute your line when you're not intending to be speaking to the group. So just some background information about this grant opportunity. There is a total of $4.15 million available from 3 different sources. The Minnesota Housing Trust Fund, which provides rental assistance. the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program, $400,000 from FHPAP, and $250,000 from the Heading Home Minnesota Funders Collaborative, which we often refer to as the philanthropic resources that are tied to the initiative. Sarah, I think that might be you that is unmuted, so if you don't mind muting your line, that would be really helpful. Thank you very much. Some unique features about this funding opportunity is that you can actually request a blend of all three of those sources through a single application. And as I hope is clear today and in the RFP itself, we're really encouraging organizations and partners that are applying to think creatively about how they use those resources in ways that it might be difficult to do if you had to apply for them each individually. The funding is over a 3-year period of time starting October 1st, and applications must be received by 4:30 p.m. on Monday, June 4th. We'll go into more detail about what that process looks like later. We do anticipate being able to notify applicants by August 1st, and that's of course contingent on a variety of factors, but that's the target that we have for when we'll be able to notify. As I said, we're really trying to encourage communities to think broadly about the challenge of ending student homelessness with this RFP, and to use the resources that are provided through it in ways that are creative and maybe different even from other programming or approaches that you've used before. So some of the funding sources have specific, fairly prescribed uses, in particular the Housing Trust Fund, but the FHPAP and the philanthropic resources are really quite flexible. And so really wanting to have that be part of what applicants consider as they're developing their proposals. There's a table represented here on the slide in too small print that is included in the request for proposals that gives you a flavor of what some of those allowable uses are across these three funding streams. This is not intended to be an exhaustive list, and I'll share that we've already had questions surface about uses that we didn't include in this table, which is great. So I just want to encourage you now and throughout today and throughout this open RFP period, wherever you have questions or ideas, the best thing to do is to reach out and ask us. And the point of contact is Diane Elias for the whole RFP, and she'll loop in others as needed to get resolution of those questions. The grounding for this opportunity and this initiative is in the magnitude of the problem and the complexity of the problem of student homelessness in Minnesota, which I think surprises a lot of people that aren't already steeped in it or familiar with it. So last October 1st, the student enrollment census that every school, public and charter school reports, identified about 8,700 homeless students that were enrolled on that day. And those students were spread over 1,200 schools and over 300 school districts, across 76 of Minnesota's 87 counties. So I think that scale, that dispersion of student homelessness is probably a surprise to a lot of Minnesotans. And really what we're wanting to tackle is how do we get our hands around the challenge that social issue poses for communities, and what are the responses that are going to be most effective in solving student homelessness. We also know that equity is central to being able to respond to student homelessness effectively. Students of color, American Indian students, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning students are vastly overrepresented, as are students with disabilities. And so, as I hope you'll see throughout the RFP, having a focus on really making sure that those strategies and solutions are responsive to that equity challenge is a critical part of getting our hands around this problem. The other grounding, and this is thanks to research conducted by Dr. Masten and her colleagues, the other grounding for a lot of this work is the fact that student homelessness has a devastating impact on educational outcomes. So this graph depicts math and reading proficiency scores at the 3rd grade. The contrasts are between all Minnesota students in public or charter schools, students that are on free and reduced lunch, which is a pretty good proxy for students in poverty, and students who are flagged as homeless. And as you can see, that even compared to their counterparts that are in poverty but housed, homeless students' educational proficiency is substantially impacted by that experience of homelessness. We see this also in terms of attendance rate and the percentage of students that are chronically absent. So a significantly larger percentage of students who are homeless end up being chronically absent, which means that they miss 10% or more of the school days in a year compared to their low-income counterparts who are housed. As we think about the outcomes that we are trying to achieve then with all of you and with applicants for this initiative, it's really around creating a path for making student homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring, and preventing it whenever we can. And so those are, in fact, the core outcomes which are aligned with the state's Heading Home Together plan that we really kind of have lifted up as being the driving outcomes we're trying to achieve in this initiative. In addition, because this is an initiative focused specifically on student homelessness, we also, of course, want to see educational improvement for those students. As we think about what it means to effectively and functionally end student homelessness, the way that we've sometimes depicted that is that if our current situation is that we have new incidents of homelessness, people experience homelessness, they exit homelessness into housing, but sometimes fall back into homelessness. What we really mean is that we want to reduce the new incidents by preventing it wherever possible. We want to make homelessness rare by increasing the number of housing outcomes that people experiencing homelessness achieve. We want to make those individual episodes as short as possible, and we want to make sure that people who land in housing are able to have the support they need to stay there successfully and stably. The other key ingredient, or another key ingredient that I think you'll see throughout this RFP, is the notion that none of us do this alone. We have to really be able to have a number of organizations and partners working together in order to get our hands around a problem of this magnitude and to do it in a way that feels sustainable. And so this is kind of one way to think about that. If this was a family, they may right now, today, in our current state, have some connection to a housing program. They may have some connection to a mainstream program like MFIT benefits or some other program that provides economic or other assistance. Their children may have connection to a school or an early learning program, but there's probably very little communication across those support systems. And so in contrast, what we're really seeking to do here is to not only approach the problem really looking at the needs of the entire family, but to do so in a way that really takes advantage of those individual assets, but connects them in a way that doesn't exist today, and also looks holistically at whatever gaps remain in what that family, what that parent, what those kids need in order to be successful, and again, create something that feels like a holistic response. To give you a little more about the background behind what we're seeking to do with this initiative, I want to just give each of the presenters today a chance to comment a little bit about the purpose and opportunity here from their perspective. And just to start that off, I'll share that as I think about the magnitude of student homelessness, not only here in Minnesota, but really across the country, this is a problem that we could solve and have not solved. And so the opportunity with this RFP is to take an important step forward in the way that we think about this solutions to this problem and really organizing community resources differently. It feels like we are in our own infancy as a nation and as a state and as communities in solving this problem, and I hope we can do better together. I'll hand it off next to Diane Elias, who can share her perspective.
Good afternoon. I am excited about this grant opportunity in particular because I think it provides an opportunity for folks to be involved in the process, and that includes the households with the lived experience. This is a chance for them to be a part of the process from the planning end as well as implementation of the program. So that's a piece of this request for proposal that I'm pretty excited about.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jean Sazevich, and I am a consultant working with a group of foundations known as the Heading Home Minnesota Funders Collaborative. The collaborative has had about a 4-year partnership with the state of Minnesota, and actually philanthropy has worked on way back the early Heading Home plan to end chronic homelessness in the state many years ago. But about the end of 2016, there was this emerging idea within the state to create this initiative. And the Heading Home Minnesota Funders Collaborative thought it would be a marvelous opportunity to work more closely with our state partners to really focus in on this population of homeless students. On a broader level, the Funders Collaborative has decided to focus on ending family homelessness and really stay in that area. And so currently there are 12 private foundations that are members of the Heading Home Minnesota Funders Collaborative. And this is such an amazing opportunity for this sector of philanthropy to try to coordinate its work further. We have silos in our work as well, and there are many funders who either focus on housing stability and ending homelessness or have it as part of their grant-making priorities, but rarely, again, do we join in a common pool, and even more rarely do we join with our public funding partners to join in a common pool. So this is a great opportunity to, again, focus in on an important and kind of overwhelming population of homeless students. Again, you know, raising awareness among ourselves and then addressing the issue in a collective way. Housing stability is such an intersectional area for no matter how, you know, what issue do you want to look at, but the fact that this zeroes in specifically on educational outcomes is also, I think, a really great opportunity for funders who maybe have that as their top priority for their private grant making resources to come together with other foundations. So we have a great group of foundations engaged in this initiative. It's not a lot of money, $250,000, but we're also trying to augment that grant making pot with other activities and building public awareness and building public will to better address the issue. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jane Tigan, and I'm with the Minnesota 2Gen Policy Network, as well as Minnesota Management and Budget. And I'll echo what Jean and Diane said about the exciting opportunity here, and maybe highlight that one thing that I'm particularly interested in, sort of from the lens of 2Gen and the results work that I'm involved in, is thinking about how all of these different partners in the system and families can come together and learn from one another. I think that there's a huge opportunity for us to better understand one another and better understand how we as the state and the partners that we have can have real systems change so that we can end student homelessness, and also understand better how to work together. There are a lot of opportunities to learn from that in this particular grant and in other spaces as well. So that systems change learning, I think, is a huge piece that I'm fascinated to see how we all do it together.
And I'm Ann Masten. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota, and I've done research for many years focused on student success coming out of a homeless situation. I've studied resilience for many years in my career, but I'm here today representing the Grand Challenge Homework Starts with Home Research Partnership, which is a collaborative effort of the University of Minnesota to team up with the folks involved in this state initiative and their community partners to try to provide more resources and know-how to make the most of the evidence that you can provide, pull the wisdom together. And I'm really excited about this because this is an opportunity to develop a partnership with synergy that we haven't seen in a long, long time. The university, of course, often is working in silos too, like we've heard about. State, we have many silos in Minnesota, and I'm excited to bring sectors together and put people on the ground doing this difficult work together with researchers to try to give them the evidence they need to show what they do and improve what they do.
Thank you all. Continuing on, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the key roles that we've described in the RFP and provide some background information about eligibility and some other definitions. As you probably have seen, the expectation is that every application is a collaborative application. There are 3 required roles, 3 other suggested roles, but the first thing I want to say is that this, again, is not an exhaustive or all-inclusive list. You are welcome to identify other roles that might be helpful if somebody could play. And that's all right, good. Yeah. So that's where we are. Okay, got it. Thank you. Okay, thanks. Sorry, momentary technical question there. So the opportunity with this RFP is really to bridge and make connections across sectors, as Anne was just talking about, and that's even reflected then in the roles that are required. So at a minimum, a lead applicant where the entity who could play the lead applicant role is pretty broadly defined, could be a nonprofit, a unit of government, a quasi-governmental agency. The application must also include participating schools. Those participating schools have to include at least 25 homeless students who are enrolled on October 1st. It can include a collection of individual schools. It can include an entire district. It can include collections of schools and districts. So it's perfectly acceptable to identify the right number of participating schools to kind of have that impact and clear that threshold criteria. But those schools being a part of the application is a requirement. In addition, a requirement to include local government entities that are responsible for mainstream housing, human services, or economic assistance programs. By mainstream there, what we mean is that those are programs that are not necessarily targeted to or only serving people experiencing homelessness. So they tend to be broader programs that may serve a larger number of people, but they can have a significant impact for people experiencing homelessness on the path back to stability. And so that those government entities are also a required partner. One question that we have fielded is around, is described in the RFP, is around what if a government entity has multiple arms or units that are involved in doing different things? Those partners could, those units of an individual government could play multiple roles within the application, as long as they are in fact providing kind of distinct and different roles from each other. And so even though they might be legally part of a single government entity, as long as different units with different responsibilities really reflecting, delivering service that are toward different domains of somebody's life, that's acceptable for the purposes of this application. That's the only exception to the collaborative requirement of the application. In addition, if your application were to request Housing Trust Fund resources, the application has to designate that Housing Trust Fund administrator. Similarly, with the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program resources, you need to designate who that grantee is. We'll talk a little more in a minute about the entities that are eligible to serve in that role. The short version is that the requirements for both Housing Trust Fund and FHPAP that apply to the program generally also apply here. In addition, for the Housing Trust Fund administrators, only current administrators are eligible. And so if you don't have a current administrator in your region, the request is that you reach out to Diane or to Elaine Volbrecht, and their contact information is included in the RFP. So if you are requesting Housing Trust Fund resources, you have to have an existing Housing Trust Fund administrator play that role for the application. Otherwise, if you're having trouble with that, please reach out to Minnesota Housing. Finally, if you are requesting philanthropic resources, you also have to designate the entity who would receive those resources if it's different from the lead applicant. And again, the criteria for who qualifies as an eligible philanthropic grantee is quite broad. So next slide. The important thing to take away from those roles is that we are anticipating that most applications will be a collaborative of a number of organizations working together. As I mentioned, a government entity can play multiple roles if distinct areas of that government entity are involved in the application. Again, only the first 3 roles are required. Roles 4 through 6 are optional, really depending on what resources you're requesting. And again, encourage your creativity. In terms of the populations that we are aiming to serve, it is 2 overlapping groups. So families who have children that are eligible for a pre-K through grade 12 academic program, and youth who themselves are eligible for an education program through grade 12 who may or may not have children of their own. So that's the overlap. Those youth may also be families, right? The definition of homelessness that we're using for the purposes of this RFP aligns with the federal McKinney-Vento Act. And so it's a fairly broad definition, really focused on whether somebody has or does not have a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. There's a definition here on the slide of what we define as imminent risk. And there are 3 kind of clear cases of this when somebody is at or below 200% of the federal poverty level, either that they're living in substandard or overcrowded housing, that they're living with somebody who's engaging in domestic violence or needing housing to escape domestic violence, or that they're paying 50% or more of their income toward housing. And then a 4th category that really just reflects the fact that there may be other situations that can be well established and documented that demonstrate imminent risk of homelessness that aren't captured in those first 3. We've defined a set of priority populations for the RFP as well. And so within those overlapping circles, really, we will be especially looking for applications that are focused on serving students and families who are currently homeless, students who are custodial parents, students with significant educational deficits, families with children in grade 5 or younger, and students experiencing homelessness on their own without their parent or guardian. So the RFP also defines a preliminary practice model, and we wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about what that practice model includes. Starting with really, what do we mean by a practice model? A practice model, this is really borrowing a concept from social work. A practice model really defines a set of principles or approaches or some common elements that may then be applied in a variety of different ways. And in the context of this request for proposals, can be applied and implemented very differently from one applicant to another, from one community to another. So it's the unifying ingredients that we hope will make Homework Starts with Home something that itself feels coherent, even though local implementations may vary in terms of how they practice the practice model. So it's really intending to define a set of values that we think have applicability, whatever your role might be in the proposal. And the hope is that they actually also provide some practical guidance about getting to those outcomes that we've defined. We described this as a preliminary practice model because our hope is, of course, that we're going to learn together and refine it as we go. So the elements of that practice model include an equity focus. As I touched on before, we believe that addressing equity is central to being able to make progress on student homelessness, that there is a high value placed on engaging families and students in actually guiding the development, design, and implementation of responses to student homelessness, that people who have experienced homelessness are themselves expert about where systems succeed or where they fail. And so that's an important value. That we want to make sure that we are identifying housing instability and homelessness as early as possible, and that we're responding to it in a way that is informed by the trauma that often precedes homelessness and accompanies the experience of homelessness. We are really looking for approaches that are adaptive and use what's been called the progressive engagement approach, that is really looking to support families at a level that achieves stability, but is adaptable to their specific needs. So typically starting with a light touch, short-term intervention, but then adjusting as needed over time to be able to actually get to that housing stability outcome. That we have a housing first orientation in this approach because the funders of this RFP believe that housing is the solution to homelessness. And so we have to remove as many barriers as we can to getting to that stable housing. that we are using two generational approaches in how we think about this. We're really looking at the family as a whole, not just individual students or their parents, but really trying to conceive of responses that attend to the entire family, and that we are leveraging mainstream resources in their critical role to be able to support people experiencing housing instability or homelessness. As you can probably tell, or I hope you can tell, we are trying to approach this also with a continuous improvement framework. So really anticipating that what we know today and what we know a couple of years from now are different things, and we in fact want to uncover the things that we don't already know and improve together how we respond to this important problem. We don't expect that you've got all that in place already. And so we would encourage you to not be discouraged if you see some of those items on the list and realize that you're not currently practicing in those ways. We are instead really looking for you to describe where you are today, what your intentions are, and help us understand kind of your ability to go on this journey with us toward really realizing and refining that practice model. We also don't want you to feel like you're alone in approaching this challenge now. And so over the course of the RFP period, starting next week, we are doing a weekly series of webinars and in-person training opportunities focused on different elements of the practice model. And so next week, we have a session focused on applying 2-gen approaches to supporting families. Following that, we have a session on leveraging mainstream systems, then a long session. Most of these sessions are 90 minutes, I should have added, and they're available either in person or over the phone or on the web. The exception to the 90-minute piece is on Friday, May 18th. We have essentially an all-day 10 to 4 session on progressive engagement and rapid rehousing. That'll be followed by a session on trauma-informed care, particularly focusing on the application of trauma-informed care in school settings. And then an example from San Francisco of a partnership between the San Francisco Unified School District and Hamilton Family Services, really to create a rapid response to any student or family identified in classrooms at San Francisco Unified School District schools. So you can get all the information that's up on this slide and indicate whether you're interested in participating in those sessions by going to the web address that's on the screen, tinyurl.com/hswh-info-sessions-2018. And that will provide all the information that you need to be able to participate in those sessions. So with that, I'm going to hand this off to Diane Elias to talk a little bit more about some of the requirements.
All right, now let me know if for some reason you can't hear me through the mic or I turn away from this microphone. So I'm mostly talking to you about the details of the RFP. That will be some of the things that you're going to need to do to make sure that when you send in your RFP application and all the corresponding documents, that it is accepted through the first set of criteria, which is the threshold criteria, and then that it is able to score well in the application process. So the threshold criteria is based on a very important piece, which means that you need to submit all of the things that are listed on the application checklist in your RFP instructions. There's an actual checklist and there are 6 items on there, and 4 are related to everybody. And then the last 2, number 5 and 6, are related to if you're applying for Housing Trust Fund dollars. So the first important thing you need to submit is the application. And the first 3 bullets on this slide also include what needs to be included in that application. We have to have the specific entities that are going to be applying, and so that may be the collaborative partners or a list of those partners. You'll also want to include the proposed budget, as well as the number of students that you've identified that are homeless and what those districts are, as Eric mentioned earlier. The application is the first item, and then the second item would be the financial documentation. And so that varies depending on if your organization's budget is 50,000 or if it's higher than 50,000 to 750,000. And there's a list of the types of financial documentation that you'll have to submit for that, but you want to be sure to do so. And then the third item that you need to make sure to submit is the affirmative action certification. You need to know where it applies to you and whether or not you need to issue also to us a certificate of compliance. Regardless, you have to fill out the affirmative action form, and there is a link to that on our website. And then the fourth item is signed letters of support, and that's from each of those collaborative partners that will be participating with you. That sort of designates that they are on board with the process and ready to be partners with you in this application. The fifth and sixth item are related to if you're applying for Housing Trust Fund dollars, and you'll have to include your local payment standards and utilities, as well as a form called 216A qualification form, and there are links in the instructions to those. If the items that you submit do not include all of the requested items on the checklist, your application can be rejected. Minnesota Housing has firmed up a lot of its grant-making policies, and so for the first time, if these things are not submitted, you may see that your application does get rejected. So that's why I'm emphasizing how important it is to get those items in. So equity here has its own slide, and the reason why is because this is a really important part of our application. One of the things that I just want to make sure that people are thinking about including in their application is the identification of the households that are disparately impacted by homelessness. Eric mentioned a few of those earlier in his slide, but we really want to see that once you've identified which populations are disparately impacted, that you also are identifying strategies that will truly make a difference in making sure that those households experience equitable outcomes as you carry out your program. And one of the other things that you want to plan for is having a conversation about how you're going to measure that, how you're going to know that the strategies that you're implementing are making a difference, especially for those that have been disparately impacted by homelessness. So we'll be looking for a narrative about that in your application. So here are the application points. There's 2 slides for those. The first section of points is for community needs, and you have an opportunity to gain 10 points in this section. Mostly here we're looking for you to use as many data sources as you have available to really show that you have a significant need in your homeless student population. We also, under collaboration, really want to see that you are participating with partners in your community that can make the greatest difference in being able to address student homelessness and increase attendance and improve those educational outcomes. And in particular, hoping that you're connecting with people that have the lived experience to be part of that process. So in your planning, in your implementation, and also in your monitoring of the results of this program, having folks that have experienced homelessness, and especially those families, being involved in the process. The program design is intended to meet the needs that you've identified in the prior section. Really, we like to see that the strategies and actions that you're going to take directly match the needs that you've identified at the beginning of your application. Often we see applications come in that maybe identify totally different strategies than the needs that have been recognized earlier. So as much as possible to make a direct match between those needs that you've highlighted. And it's also an opportunity for you to leverage your partners or other programs if they're addressing some of the needs that you highlighted, but it's not going to be a part of your application, just to note that that's actually happening on a different front, so that we don't think that you've identified needs that you're not going to be actually taking action for, if that makes sense. You can see we have 20 points related to the equity piece, and that we described earlier, but some of the other things that you can consider are the staff who are involved in providing the program and whether or not the staff and your leadership reflect the community that you're serving. And then just the things that I mentioned earlier about making sure that you have strategies that directly tie to that greater impact and making sure that you have equitable outcomes. In the budget, we do want to see a pretty fine detail to know exactly what you're expending funds on. In particular, if you're using funds for something creative or something that's considered undesignated or we might not understand, to really give us some detail about that. So for example, if you say we're going to be using some funds for rent assistance, that's pretty clear. We know what rent assistance is going to be. If you say that you're going to provide funding for moving expenses, we might want to know what that entails. Is it like hiring 2 guys in a truck for 5 households at $200? Just some kind of detail to give us an idea of where you're going with that particular budget item. And especially with the things that are innovative. And then just to know how much of the funding and for what purpose it's going to each of your partners in your application. We also look at administrative capacity. In particular, this is where you get to highlight the success that you've had in administering similar programs. In some cases, that might be the actual funding sources, such as FHPAP, or you might be a housing trust administrator. You want to be able to highlight your partner's strengths as well, talking about any programs that they've administered that are similar, any other types of experiences that they've had, and in particular, highlighting any capacity of being able to serve those populations that are disparately impacted as well. So the timing of the application is that everything is due on June 4th at 4:30. Obviously, the earlier submit, the better, just in case. We don't accept late applications, usually under any circumstances, so that deadline is really important. And then by Friday, July 27th, that's our goal for being able to notify applicants, but as Eric mentioned, it's likely that we'll get to you by August 1st, but we're trying to go for as soon as July 27th. We also plan to start the contracting process. In that situation, if you're notified that you've been selected, you will have a number of due diligence items that will need to be submitted to us, and it's a really fast time frame. So all of the due diligence items that we would be requesting would have to come back by August 31st. And then at that point, we would issue your agreement to be signed. In order to submit your application materials, you have to use our secure portal. There are instructions in a link in your RFP instructions that say upload tool instructions. And what I like about those instructions is that they're actually screenshots so that you can see how it looks on your screen and what you should click on. But I would suggest trying it out far ahead of time. Maybe upload your affirmative action certificate or something just to try it out. You don't have to submit everything on the same day, but that way you can test it, make sure that you understand how the documents get submitted, and we'll be confident when it comes to the deadline that you can get it in there. If you have questions or just want to walk through the process over the phone, you can give me a call and I can help you figure out how to get connected in there. So the due diligence items are the items we'll be requesting if you're selected. In particular, the board resolution, I just want to make sure that people are aware that we require a board resolution from the organization who's the lead applicant or any other organization that would have a separate agreement. So for example, if you're an HTF administrator as a partner, but you're not the lead applicant, we might generate one agreement with the lead applicant for other funding and one agreement with the HTF administrator. Both of those parties would need a board resolution. So just to have that on your radar, that you may need to go to your board in August, and because you only have that 30-some days, you want to make sure that you're kind of on their calendar. Worst case, you can set it up, pull the agenda item, but we just want that on people's radar. Also, as Eric mentioned, some of the rules for FHPAP and HTF still apply, and so for FHPAP, if you're in greater Minnesota, you do need to have county board resolutions from each participating county where you're going to have that as a part of your service area. So just keeping that in mind so that you can plan for the timing of the board resolutions that you need. And then we also request a certificate of insurance. The most important piece of this, and the reason why it most often gets rejected, is that it does not say employee dishonesty or crime coverage. Instead, people submit a certificate of insurance to us that has general liability or something like that on there, but that won't make it through our process. It really has to be a set aside of 1/8 of the funds for employee dishonesty crime coverage. The certificate of good standing is required for all non-governmental entities, and you get that through the state of Minnesota, the Secretary of State office. And I believe there actually is a fee. We were looking that up today, so just something to keep in mind that you have to have that certificate in order to submit the due diligence item. Then we'll also be giving you a work plan, and that'll be a form that we'll be submitting to you. It will just have mostly updates about what your application is going to do that's different than what you submitted, and potentially some of the other outcomes or things like that that we might be asking about post-selecting you. And then you'll probably be revising your budget. Most of the time, the awards don't completely match budgets. If you're lucky, it will, and you won't have to revise, but most of the time, people have to revise, so we'll get a revised budget from you as well. And we also are requiring a memorandum of understanding between the collaborative partners as a part of that process. So once that happens, you will receive your agreement and we'll execute that. And then will just be the regular things that you do when you receive a grant from one of our agencies or from your philanthropic partners, which is that you'll be submitting reports to us, you'll maintain client records, you'll make sure that you have your financial records in place for when we come out to monitor, and so on. And the last and final piece allows me to turn it over to Anne, who's going to talk to you about the Grand Challenge.
So you'll note that one of the requirements is to participate in this research and evaluation process that we've started. Some of you may have heard in recent years that the University of Minnesota has been funding grants, internal grants, to support bringing sectors together to solve big problems. And a group of us, in collaboration with key leaders in the Homework Starts at Home initiative, both at the state and in the community, applied for and were awarded one of these grants from the university. And it's one of the largest ones they've given out. And the goal in our Grand Challenge project is to bring partners together and try to address and support evidence-based solutions for the problem of student homelessness. And we've been very fortunate to bring together a leadership team that's comprised of university faculty, myself in child development and research on homeless families, Maria Hanratty in the Humphrey Institute, who's done research for many years on homelessness, and Eric Grumdahl is our lead partner at the state. And we've also been able to get funding for 2 large centers at the university that you may be familiar with that do a lot of helpful evaluation and integrated data research. Those are CARE, which I can never remember what this stands for, but it's the Center for Applied Research and Educational Improvement, and also MinLink, which stands for Minnesota's Linking Information for Kids. And these 2 agencies bring a lot of research capacity, and we're providing the funding for them to help partners in the Homework Starts at Home initiative that are chosen for this, these projects, to try to get as much information and evidence as they can about what's working in their programs and what's working for whom and so forth. We are going to try to identify and build an evidence base that will be helpful to programs that are involved as well as to policymakers. We've included funding for policy reports, for graduate students to help with data analysis, and we've planned on a conference where we hope everybody can join in to share in what we've learned. So here we are. I didn't press any of these buttons. Okay, so there's some of our goals. But what I wanted to highlight here is that this is an unusual effort to put together a research team of community partners, state agencies, faculty at the university, and students to try to address these issues. And we're planning the research together. There's no already been designed research project. We are trying to engage the partners in an ongoing process and try to inform that continuous improvement model that Eric was talking about. Here's a list of the faculty who are affiliated with this project. And I wanted to point out that the faculty in this work, including myself, are all volunteers who are contributing their time in kind to this activity. And they represent a wide spectrum of expertise that we hope can provide support to the programs that get involved in this and help us all to work together to provide great evidence to guide future programs, but also to convince policymakers to provide more support for the programs that work. And then here's the state of Minnesota team members, and you can see that MDE and housing and other agencies are involved, and it's been great already. We've started collaborating, and it's been fantastic to have a team working together across the divide of university and state agencies. And now we're just beginning to bring in community partners. We want to learn what we can from qualitative and quantitative research from the initial folks who are involved in the pilot efforts that guided this initiative. And then as your projects roll forward, we will work with award winners to try to bolster the kind of evidence you can glean from the work that you're doing. And our hope is that we will end up with a fantastic amount of evidence, but also a platform for future work to keep this kind of collaboration going.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Diane. So we're at the very exciting time of this session where we get to hear from all of you. And so just excited to invite your questions. If you're joining us in the room, what I would ask you to do is if you'd like to pose a question, make sure that you're near a microphone or have one passed to you. And then there's a little button on the base of the microphone you have to press so that it's illuminated in green. And that will then allow the mic to pick up the audio so folks on the phone can hear it. For those of you on the phone, you're also welcome to chime in, and we'll just try to manage this so we're not talking over each other as best we can. I'm also going to show now the questions that have come in already. And so we can either start with those, or if anybody has a burning question either in the room or on the phone prior to that, I'm happy to see where we might start. Why don't we start with the ones that are up here, just looking around the room. So what is a quasi-governmental agency? It's a special class of entities that essentially, if you are one, you know it. And there's not a general broad description, but there are some very unique cases. These are often corporations that are established by a state or county government, but they only work at the behest of that state or county government. And so if you don't know that you're a quasi-governmental entity, you're not. The next question is, will we be explaining more about the funding as it relates to schools, social workers, or school liaisons? I would invite whoever posed that question, if you're able to say a little bit more about the kind of additional information that would be helpful. That would be good to understand that. So whether you're on the phone or in the room, or if you want to write in some additional information about that question, that would be terrific. And while we wait for that to happen, the question in red, if more than one school is participating, does each school have to have a minimum 25 students? No. The total amount of all the students that are participating has to be 25 or greater. You can include a number of schools that get you to that 25 threshold. And again, in addition, as Diane covered, we will be looking at the total amount of need that are represented by the participating schools as a competitive factor. And so, there's a balancing act there between how big the collaboration gets and how much impact it has. But we are looking for a total of at least 25 across all the schools which you've identified. Thanks for that question. In blue, will MHSA, MDE, DHS be actively supporting sites in their pursuit of 2-gen practices? It is noticeable that DEED is absent. Related to that question, there are a variety of activities, including the session that is scheduled next Thursday around how you apply 2-gen practices that we already have anticipated. And one of our hopes is that throughout implementation, we're going to be able to continue to do that kind of learning and other opportunities. There are also a variety of opportunities, and so I'm now going to give Jane a heads up that I might pitch this question over to her, that the state and others have been involved in around 2-gen practices that would also be available. So Jane, you might have to turn your mic to green if there's anything else you'd like to add along those lines.
Yes, I will say that as Eric mentioned, the Minnesota 2-gen Policy Network has had a series of trainings and with partners at the University of Minnesota as well as housed within the state. And we will be sending those out. So at the info session on Thursday next week, I'll have more information about how people can sign up for those training opportunities and practitioner meetups. I think there's also a lot of room for us to bring in additional partners or thought partners as we move forward in the work together. So within the 2-gen network, we have agency representation from DEED and other agencies. And I think we see each other all as avenues for collaboration. So I will say that while DEED isn't here right now, we certainly can bring them in and think through what sort of how they can be helpful in the process for the sites that receive funding and potentially beforehand. If we hear things at the info session that are specific and we want DEED to help us think through those, we have the routes to do that.
So the question in red about what age grade constitutes pre-K and do those children have to be enrolled in programming? The language of the RFP is that they have to be eligible for a pre-K program. Pre-K is literally right before kindergarten. So if there is an established definition which you can find on MDE's website, and we'll include that in the written response here as well for kind of what qualifies as a pre-K program that somebody would be eligible for. And then the question in green, would a CDA qualify for FHPAP, or do you consider a CDA quasi-government? Those are actually two separate questions. Whether a CDA is a quasi-governmental entity depends on the CDA. There's not a general answer to that. Whether they are qualified for FHPAP depends in part on where they're located. And Diane, I don't know if there's anything else you'd want to add on that question, but I'd happy to turn that over to you if you would.
So in greater Minnesota, counties, tribal nations, nonprofits with sponsoring board resolutions would be eligible. The CDA, we would have to look at the board makeup and how it was applying to determine whether or not it was a government entity or considered a nonprofit, because in some cases it can be a little bit of both. And so we just have to try to make that determination and see how we could make that work.
And it's probably also fair to say that if in any specific case like that, you have a particular question about your application or your eligibility, those are great questions to bring to Diane so we can really ferret out the nuance of that question. All right, here's another one that's popped in. Can we talk a little bit more about rental assistance pilot and how it led to this RFP? So the Homework Starts with Home initiative is informed by a variety of kind of efforts that have happened here and elsewhere, here in Minnesota and elsewhere around ending homelessness, including Minnesota's homeless and highly mobile rental assistance pilot for families with school-age children. I think if I got that title right, it's a little bit of a mouthful. Often just called the Homeless and Highly Mobile Pilot. That pilot initiative has operated since 2013 in 3 sites, the Northside Achievement Zone, the St. Paul Promise neighborhood, and Clay County. And certainly the information, the evidence, the impact that pilot had was an important part of being able to make the case to create Homework Starts at Home, and has informed a lot of the thinking about what goes into the model. Are there any other questions either for folks here in the room or on the phone? You can throw this wide open now. All right. Will we send out these slides? Yes, slides will be posted on both Minnesota Housing and MDE's website soon. There's a process to get those online, but they'll be available shortly. Ooh.
I have a question.
Please.
I find this grid of allowable uses a bit challenging to understand.
Well, yeah.
Just to be frank, I'm with Minneapolis Public Housing, and we're very excited about this, but I'm just struggling to get a picture of what it would look like. So, for example, to submit a budget, if we're applying for all these 3 sources, does the budget need to be a grid too, to show how much is coming from each? Or, I mean, how does this really work with these 3 different funding streams?
So we provided a lot of, thank you for the question, we provided a lot of flexibility about how organizations and applicants organize their budgets, recognizing that that may vary a lot from one particular application to another. And so, I think if as you suggested, if presenting your budget as a grid was a way to help organize that and make sense of it, that's certainly allowable as you think about developing the budget. One simple way to distinguish the 3 funding sources is that the Housing Trust Fund's primary use, its typical use, is for rental assistance. FHPAP has a broader range of uses, but they tend to be really focused on more short-term expenditures and interventions. The exception there might be the staffing to actually support those short-term interventions. And then the philanthropic resources really are the most flexible. And so I'd be happy to give Diane and Jean a chance to say any more that they might like about that grid. But what the grid is really attempting to show you is here's a flavor of some of the things you could pay for with these different sources. Jean?
And I will jump in. Great question. And as you can see from the grid, the philanthropic resources are, I think everyone had a dot as an allowable. And I think what we encourage in terms of thinking about the philanthropic resources, which I just also want to clarify, those will be contracted for separately. And the reason for that is, again, we see those resources as the most flexible, knowing that you guys are going to need to, grantees are going to need to change things as they roll out. And we want to be able to respond and be flexible with the philanthropic resources as quickly as possible as you learn. So we think that you can propose any of the items on the grid. We like to think of them as very capacity building focused, with a very broad definition of how we think of capacity building. So it could be for staffing, it could be for training, it can be for needs that you identify to be the most successful in meeting the goals of the initiative.
And I think we wanted to provide the greatest flexibility that we could, which is why we didn't design a budget template to be submitted, because we wanted to make sure that people had the opportunity to be creative in what they designed. At the same time, there are certainly examples of Housing Trust Fund budget forms and FHPAP expenditure budget forms on our website underneath those programs. You'll be able to find templates there. So if that's useful to you to kind of start from there and then maybe build on one of those, that's another option as well. And sometimes it's easier to think separate programs first and then merge them together later.
Please.
Can I keep going? Okay.
Yes.
So really, we could submit 3 budgets?
No, we're
In a
looking for a
way,
single. We're looking for a
one
single budget. I think what Diane was suggesting is that those existing budget templates may be helpful in terms of thinking about how you would structure the role that each of those funds might play.
Okay.
And then, your single budget could be like a concatenation of those individual budgets, if that's the best way for you to present them.
Okay.
So there's some guidance in the RFP really around what we're looking for, the level of detail that we're looking for in the budget to be able to evaluate it. And I would say that in any specific case, if you have questions about your budget presentation, that's a great thing to bring to them.
Okay.
Other questions? Oh, there's another one up here. Oh, thank you. Great. So how will house families work with schools? I think that's a great question for you to answer in the context of your application. I don't think there's a single answer to that question, and so really invite you to explore that with your partners in your application development. Will separate applications from similar areas be allowed, i.e. Hennepin County in one and Minneapolis in another? There is no geographic requirement around any individual application or having multiple applications for the same area. That's perfectly permissible. So yes, they would be allowed. Similar applications, separate applications from similar areas would be allowed. Any other questions, either from folks in the room or folks joining remotely?
I have another one.
All right, please.
So can you either pick just one of the funding streams, or do you have to do all 3?
So you do not have to do all 3. You could apply for only a single funding stream. Those 3 roles, or the first 3 roles, are still required. And then which of the other 3 roles you would include depends on what you apply for. So if you only applied for a single funding stream, you would still need to have the 3 required roles in addition to potentially another role to receive those funds. Oh, great. Thank you. Do housing programs have to have 25 students in their housing to be eligible? I'm not entirely sure that I understand that question. The number of students is really a requirement attached to the participating school, not to housing programs. But if whoever asked that question wants to follow up with Diane, we might be able to get into more of the specifics and make sure we're giving you good guidance on that question. Any other questions? Oh, we might have had another one happen. Let's see. All right. Is there a state geographic priority breakdown, 50% metro, 50% greater Minnesota? We are looking for a diverse distribution of funds in terms of what activities are supported and where they occur, recognizing the wide geographic distribution of student homelessness, but there is not a defined ratio for where the dollars go. That's really going to be determined in the evaluation of applications. These are really good questions, so appreciate people putting them out there. Will the evaluations be parallel or specific to each applicant? Our goal is to have an evaluation, and I would welcome your thoughts on this as well, but to have an evaluation that really looks across the entire initiative. But I think as Anne conveyed, we're also really wanting to help develop evidence across the range of interventions that might be proposed. So my suspicion, I mean, this will be determined down the road, but my suspicion is it's probably a combination of some uniqueness and some things that are common across all sites that we select for Homework Starts with Home. And anything you want to add to that?
I would agree, and we didn't specify that because we don't really know how diverse the programs are who are applying, and any kind of evaluation and evidence needs to be tailored a bit to the nature of the activities, but it would be nice to have some commonalities across the different programs so that we can pool some of the evidence.
Great. So another question that's popped up here. Are families in shelter a priority population? Families in shelter may meet one or more of the defined priority populations. They are not by themselves a defined priority population. So I think depending on the situation that those families find themselves in, they may very well qualify as one of the other priority populations. Anne.
Sorry. So, Eric, you know what I'm going to say about the 25 students. So, you know, the 25 students that are it's the minimum threshold to even start when you're identifying, but I'm assuming that you don't just have to work with that 25, like that's the number of students
Correct.
you work with. You could work throughout whoever comes into the school throughout the course of the year.
The 25 student threshold is a minimum, not a maximum.
Okay, and then have like FHPAP monies ever gone into a school district to pay for like a school social worker? Like, is that a possible thing?
I'm going to pitch that question to Diane.
So I think we're trying to be as creative as possible. And there's a separate part of the statute related to the school stability that allows us to be a little bit more flexible. So I'd have to look at that. In some of the flexibility is around like how long we can provide rent assistance for, and some of the circumstances around how you don't have to have an advisory committee to be a part of the school stability piece. I think if the social worker in the school is contributing to the housing stability of the household, that would be a direct tie to the stably housed outcome, which is what we're looking for in our program specifically. And so then I could see that you could make a justification for doing something like that.
Yeah, okay. But that money can flow in that way. Like you wouldn't have to take FHPAP money to go to a lead agency to go to a school.
You would have to, for FHPAP to flow directly to a school, the school would have to meet the eligibility for receiving those funds directly. And so whether it does or not varies based on a variety of factors.
Yeah, and if not, FHPAP can have the lead applicant apply if they're eligible, and then they can subgrant those funds. So it's definitely possible to do that through a subcontract relationship.
So another question here about, are those with lived experience involved in the evaluation development partnership? Yes, absolutely, and something that really is primarily on the shoulders of the Grand Challenge team as we make sure that that's part of the design, but we'll definitely be looking to participating sites, selected applications, to help do that on an ongoing basis with the evaluation. So I appreciate that question. Anne, anything you want to add about that?
No, just to agree that part of the evaluation, part of the qualitative evaluation would include folks with lived experience, and we would hope to attract similar folks to be in the advisory group as well.
And I do want to jump in very quickly on that because the Funders Collaborative has specifically called out the compensation at a real level for people with lived experience, not only in evaluation, but in program design. And thinking about the use of philanthropic support for those activities beyond a pizza party or a gift card, or it's very important, and I want to call that out.
Thank you both. How does this interact with the coordinated?
No problem. I was just going to say that FHPAP, the administrative dollars would allow for payment of some kind to help people with transportation or other needs to be able to get participation from folks with lived experience as well. So that's allowable through the administration portion.
So how does this interact with the coordinated entry systems? That's another one of these questions where there is not an answer. That's a good thing for you to contemplate as you're developing your proposal and to be able to describe as part of what you're proposing, but it's not something where there is a single answer. So I think that's probably the most that I'm able to say about that at this point. Can you put the slide up with things that are allowed? I think what I will do is instead refer you to the RFP where that table is presented, And so you can see those details there probably more legibly than you could see them on the slide anyway, and that allows us to keep us on the questions as they pop in. So thank you for these good questions. This is really helpful. This is really what we were hoping to have happen today. So I appreciate that people have brought good questions for us to think about. Are there any other questions? Well, with that, I want to thank you again for coming today. We really do view this as being a journey that we are really just beginning, and look forward to sharing with the applications that are selected. We want to encourage you again that if you have any questions, to reach out to us. I want to remind you that there's some additional information that you have access to on both MDE's website and Minnesota Housing's website. And again, to remind you that if you're interested in exploring more of how you might implement those specific elements of the practice model into your application and into your proposal, there's the info sessions coming up, one every week from now until the end of May, and you can participate either remotely or in person. Last thing to emphasize again, if you have any questions, that's really what we're here for. So please do reach out, contact Diane. Her contact information is on the slide and available in the RFP and on the Minnesota Housing website. So thank you all for being here, and good luck with your application and proposal development. Thanks a lot. Thank you.